Well, we've proven without a doubt that the garden is by far and large on a homestead the most important thing as far as the amount of food brought in and cost savings. So we're getting a little bit of a head start compared to normal on our garden plans this year.
It is a bright, sunshiny day here in spring, and what better time than to talk about manure on the homestead. On a homestead, no matter what animal you have, you will find yourself dealing with what you're going to see behind me here, clumps of manure and animal waste, whether it's rabbits, sheep, ponies, anything. You have to deal with that. And every spring as the snow melts around here, that's what we find out in the pastures. So today we're going to go through with you our process of what we do with our manure on the homestead. And you know what? It's actually very surprising how simple it really is. So as you can see out here, we have the sheep pasturing right now, but previously we did have the ponies. Now, one thing I will say is when it comes to the sheep manure, for the most part, we aren't bothering with that. It disintegrates and breaks down and fertilizes the pasture beautifully. What we're kind of talking about here more is the horse or pony manure that does provide a lot of nutrients, but it does also clump and cause problems with grass growth. So we're going to kind of scoop this all out of here and you'll see what I mean. Some of this has been sitting for a while and underneath that grass is sure trying to grow, which means that the nutrients, some of them have actually gone into the ground from the manure, which is nice because then we're going to take it and put it into the garden.
So one of the uses that we're going to use this for this year is to fill this raised bed. We put this L in last year, never got it filled with anything, and we still have a couple months before we're going to plant this. And that's one of the secrets to this, is this will break down a little bit in the next 2 months before we are able to plant it.
And I know right now, half of you at least are going, you can't plant directly into that manure, right? I know that's what you're thinking.
But our plan is to plant squash in here. And really, that's the theme of this video, is making manure piles kind of like this. And planting it with squash is a great way to help break it down. And the squash does really well growing in this kind of medium. So you can see this 4x4 bed, we've pretty much filled up as much as we're going to. And yes, this is fairly dry right now because we've taken it off the pasture and we have very dry conditions for early spring.
Scarily.
Now, one thing we try to avoid a little bit is too much hay. This does have some hay in it, which is okay. But we find this kind of method, if you've got too much hay or too much of that sort of brown matter, it doesn't really break down. And obviously this is not something that we're going to turn at all. We're just going to keep adding on top once this does break down a bit.
So we've pretty much tapped out how much manure we really want in here. We've got a couple inches still to fill, and as Chris mentioned, it's all going to settle down. But one thing you'll see here is we've avoided putting extra manure at the front, and that's because, which I'm going to splice in right now, we're going to be putting a trellis here for beans, and the beans don't like that much richness. So we're going to fill this a little bit more with stuff for things that will grow on the trellis and keep the back end here for the squash. But now that we've got this bed filled, I am going to take you and show you one other method that we use, which is already completed for this season, and then we're going to go to last year's pile and take a look at how it's broke down. All right, so in front of me here is basically our gold pile. This is where we're going to be growing our winter squash, or at least our Canada crookneck winter squash for this year. So basically what you're seeing here is where we cleaned out the barn from the winter and also a little bit of cleaning up pastures. But for the most part, this had a lot of hay and things like that in it, as well as the manure from the sheep and the ponies. And we've just put the tarp over it for the spring, and we're going to leave it alone until June when it's time to plant. But this is what we do every year. We make our gold piles to grow our winter squash in. And as you're going to see here in a minute, we're going to go look at last year's pile and just how beautiful it's turned out to then be composted out onto the garden. No turning of the soil, no nothing. It's just simple. Plant the plants, let them suck what they want out of it, and that's about it. And here behind me is one of our piles from last year's winter squash. And as you can see, it is broke down beautifully and ready for some turning and into the garden. We haven't done anything with this other than pull all the vines from the squash out of it. The chickens have worked a little bit around the edges, but not a whole lot of tilling going on. So I'm curious to see just how broke down this is once we dig in. Oh, look at that. Oh, and the worms. So many worms.
So as Stephanie said, this is not a pile that we turned or anything like that. And it's gone to a really nice sort of black earth type soil. And now we are going to basically steal a bunch of this to top up some of our raised beds. And whatever's left at the end, once we've done all that, we'll just spread out into the garden because, yeah, this is a very, very simple way to not only compost that waste, but put it to use sort of the immediate year after you've made the pile, and obviously extend it well beyond that.
Look at that, there's a bunch more. See if I can break it up here. That's a sign of some good composting manure, in my opinion.
So there we go, one wheelbarrow full of what's some pretty nice looking soil, and we still have
a lot more
that we can steal from for some of our raised beds and barrel gardens.
All right, so now we're on to our final stage, and we're standing in front of our oldest manure pile. Now this has been composting for at least 2 years. Granted, we've added some rabbit manure and things like that over time, but the one thing you're going to notice is this one had a lot of hay matter in it. We had learned from this that the hay matter is kind of a problem, and you can see that it hasn't broke down as well in parts. But we're going to dig into this and see what it looks like. So here you can see this part I'm talking about, where that hay just takes a little bit longer to break down considering how long it has been here. We come down to an area where the hay was not so much of a problem. That is nicely broke down, almost sandy in some places, but basically gone to dirt. All those wood chips, things like that, have all broke down. So this is going to make our top layer, and then we may purchase a little bit of topsoil to go on top of that afterwards, but we'll see when the time comes. As Chris mentioned earlier, we have 2 months before we're going to be planting this bed. Well, in typical Hickorycroft fashion, we're 2 weeks later. The weather got bad. We had a little family vacation, and now we're back at it. So we're finally going to get the rest of this second year compost shoveled up and put onto that raised bed that we've been working on so hard.
All right, well, we're back over here again. We actually had some pretty good rain over the last week, which is kind of beneficial because everything we've put in here so far has kind of settled in a bit. The rain's basically rehydrated everything. We were working with pretty dry material the other week. So all we're going to do today is top it right up. We're going to fill these pretty much flush to the top because I expect in the next 2 months they are going to shrink down a little bit.
As a side note, it better be planted in less than 2 months.
So I think the take-home message here is you can take material that you might have around your homestead and easily convert it into something usable. And even though we're not planting in fresh manure, as you've kind of seen, this is not super broke down. You just have to plan what you're going to plant in that kind of material sort of accordingly, i.e. highly recommend squash. So on that note, we're going to finish this up and have at least one little job ready before gardening season really starts.
Not only did we get our L bed all filled up, it doesn't have its topsoil on it yet, but it is going to be rotting down for a little while. We are now working on this double, so it ends up being a 4x8 raised bed here. You've seen this one in numerous videos when we've been harvesting our kale seeds. So this year we were ruthless and we ripped everything out so that we could get it topped up again. So that pile also delivered a couple loads of compost to fill this, and we happen to have a pile of topsoil still sitting from last year. So we're hoping to get these 2 beds done because we're going to cover them. So we'll bring it back when we're ready to do that. All right, so we have our beds full. We've pulled out our long plastic cover, and our plan is now to get this covered up with our plastic, kind of like a greenhouse effect, to warm up this soil because I plan to start planting this as soon as possible.
Well, that's couple of jobs all done now. So the next part is we've got to go inside and actually start some of our cool season crops.